So, chapter 3 in your book is sort of a sales pitch for why anthropology is important. Um, I made a case for this in the introduction, and I'm going to continue to make a case for the importance of anthropology in your life, in your career, and I hope that will become evident to you by the end of this course. But this chapter is specifically about a subject that is about the practical applications of anthropology. And we tend to think of academic disciplines like anthropology as very abstract, very philosophical, very theoretical, very academic. And they are. It can be. And in fact, in the last chapter, I talked about how when collecting data, you need to be objective about it. You can't really think about how am I going to use this data to influence or implement change. Because if you already go into a study knowing what you're going to find, then you're going in with a bias and it won't be accurate. We can do that already. You can have your own, you don't need anthropology to decide on something and do it. So anthropology is a way that you can gather data about humans and human behavior in a way that has verifiable, testable facts that you can use to inform you for making better decisions in real life applications. So applied anthropology is an aspect of anthropology that you should know about early on, but you're going to need to learn how to do anthropology as a scientist before you can get to that point. So theoretical or academic anthropology is one sort of direction that you can take, and there are plenty of anthropologists that have careers in academic or theoretical anthropology, and they talk to other anthropologists. They help to refine and improve how anthropology operates as a discipline. That's really important. It shouldn't be underestimated. But at the same time, that remains an obscure discipline that maybe is a little bit hard for someone who isn't an anthropologist to understand. So what I want to go through is the other direction that you can take anthropology in, which is applied anthropology, and see how these four fields that we've been talking about can be applied to everyday real-life circumstances. Anthropologists today, if you get a job as an anthropologist or with using your anthropological skills, you may not be called an anthropologist in that role. If you get a job as an anthropologist, you probably are a theoretician or an academic that is working in that direction. But the skills that you acquire as an anthropologist can be applied to anything that humans are involved in. And a lot of anthropologists are employed, sometimes at much larger salaries than the academic anthropologists, working on things that for groups that promote, manage, and assess programs aimed at influencing human behavior and social conditions. Now that's pretty broad. Those skills that you acquire as an anthropologist can be applied to almost any aspect of life. So let's look at those four fields again. What are those? That's biological or physical anthropology, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. And you can probably already imagine some of the applications that each of these branches have, but we're going to go into detail about them. So let's just look briefly an overview. Biological anthropologists often work in places like public health, nutrition, genetic counseling, aging, looking at people who are getting older in life, things like substance abuse, mental illness, and even things like criminology and forensic anthropology would often fall under biological anthropology. Archaeologists are often academics as well, but they can also be involved in the private sector. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter, but a a term called cultural resource management, or CRM, is the sort of commercial side of archaeology. Whenever a new road or pipeline or any sort of development building takes place, there are guidelines in the state, local, and federal laws that dictate how you can proceed with development. And you're not allowed to destroy archaeology. That's in the laws. So you developers often will employ professional archaeological groups to on contract to preserve and study the archaeology that is found during that development. Also, public education programs, archaeologists can be employed to educate people about the past and to link especially local indigenous communities with the resources that are available, archaeological resources that are available in that area. And of course, historic preservation and museum studies also would fall under that as well. Cultural anthropologists can often be found working alongside social workers or business people. We've all heard of corporate culture, right? It is a culture, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And they can work with advertisers, for instance, to identify what appeals to people and what fits in with cultural norms, or what might grate against people and what might be useful for businesses. Factory workers, medical professionals, school personnel, economic development experts, these are all people that can benefit from understanding human behavior, especially in micro groups. And then linguistic anthropologists, while studying abstractly languages and communication, often work with schools in districts in which a wide range of languages and dialects is spoken, and also communication amongst different aspects of societies. So applied anthropology depends upon, and we talked a little bit about this in the last chapter, it depends upon the so-called ethnographic method. That is to say, the ethnographic method, which we'll talk about more in depth in chapter 13, involves first-hand study and participant observation. It also takes a holistic look at the entirety of a group of people, their biological, cultural, and social systems, to try and understand them. But very importantly, the ethnographic method is first-hand observation, recording facts. Now, we talked in the last chapter about etic perspective. That's important for the ethnographic method, that you want data and facts that you can use to describe a culture and then be able to compare that culture to others. That's really important. So, for instance, let me just give you an example. Let's take corporate culture, right? So cultural anthropologists, and in fact there are, for large corporations, some of them actually, especially international corporations that have branches in different countries, will employ full-time anthropologists. They're even called that. They're on the books as an anthropologist to understand corporate culture. Because do you think that corporate culture for a company that had a branch in America is going to be the same as the same company's corporate culture in a place like Japan? No, they're probably going to be very different. And what if you combine the two? What if you cross over? What if you send people from America to Japan, or Japanese employees over to America? You may have a clash of cultures, and it's an anthropologist who can help to minimize conflicts and increase things like efficiency. This can be extremely important for the operation of a big company. And so this is just one example of how the lessons that we learn from theoretical and academic anthropology can be applied in real-world situations. But that anthropologist that works for the corporation needs to employ the ethnographic method. They can't just guess at how they wouldn't get paid very much if they were just guessing about corporate culture. They would need to apply first-hand observations and data collection to try and come up with a system that would improve efficiency in that circumstance. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of applications for anthropology in the real world. Real meaning non-academic. Anthropology is, as a discipline, formed in the 19th century, but in the early 20th century and by about World War II, there were some problems that were being created, especially in the application of anthropology in real-world situations. Anthropologists that did their research in universities and traveled around were just talking to other anthropologists. But in the colonial system, this was actually informing policy. And we'll have some chapters later on about colonialism and globalism, but also race and ethnicity. And in the first applications of anthropology into policy making, anthropology was getting some things wrong. It was making assumptions and assuming that certain things like race was scientifically determined. It's not. It's a cultural phenomenon. It is not a biological phenomenon. And scientific racism actually was a real problem that anthropology was perpetuating. It was after World War II, in the 50s and the 60s, that anthropology really did its most development. It started asking questions about itself. And so this is where academic anthropology is extremely important. You have to question your methods to make sure you're getting it right and you don't have abuses of some of your methods in the real world. So anthropology needed to ask these questions in the 50s and 60s, and then in the 1970s, anthropology began to grow as an applied discipline, and you started to see anthropologists using their methodologies outside in things like international organizations, government programs, businesses, hospitals, schools, all these sorts of things from the 1970s onward. During this time, anthropologists were actually asked to consider the wider social value and implications of their research. And so data collection still needs to remain objective, but there's an increasing push to encourage anthropologists to apply their data to improve the situation for groups that they're studying. That said, there are ethical concerns about this. Now, ethical concerns like we had World War II and prior to World War II about scientific racism and colonialism being used to exploit people. But also, if you're applying your data to influence policy or you need to have a code of ethics to apply that. We'll look a little bit more carefully at some of these things later on. But for instance, humans have rights. And if you're studying humans, they're not your little playthings that you can experiment with. So codes of ethics were established by bodies such as the American Anthropological Association that have guidelines for how you should conduct research. And what you should do, but also what you shouldn't do. Like, for instance, there's sometimes difficulty criticizing programs that you've participated in or that were part of your funding for data collection. And so remaining objective about the data collection is important, but that can be difficult to do without establishing distinct codes of ethics. Now, there are basically three roles that applied anthropologists can enact. That is that they can identify locally perceived needs for change. So identifying what needs to change from the perception of those in that local group. to work with local people to design culturally appropriate and socially sensitive change, and also to protect local people from harmful policies and projects, even the ones that you may be implementing. And so it's important to see all sides when you're applying anthropology, and I'll talk about a couple examples in a moment here. So some of the branches of applied anthropology that we can break this down a little bit further is, for instance, development anthropology. Development is something where there are institutions, governments, non-governmental organizations that try to set policies to improve various aspects of life, the economy, society, health conditions, these sorts of things. It's the anthropologist's job to try and see the broad holistic approach to see where unforeseen issues may arise. And this will guide policies and help to plan them. In addition to just carrying out, just saying, okay, I think this is a great idea, let's do it. The anthropologist identifies how policy can come into some problems. So, for instance, ethical dilemmas, when a planner's interests don't necessarily can coincide with the best interests of the local people. So, for instance, a developer, so let's say a cattle rancher in Brazil wants to start grazing beef, but to do that you've got to cut down forests. Great for the cattle rancher, great maybe even for the state economy to have a big business like that. But what are the wider impacts of cutting down forests? What are the people that maybe aren't going to be involved in cattle ranching? How's that going to affect them? How's it going to affect the planet? Is that going to have local effects? Will it have global effects? So this is what and there's ethical dilemmas, because you may not want to stop progress, you may not want to stop economic development, but anthropologists will identify where this can actually hurt and help. So a commonly stated goal of developmental projects is increased equity, which means a reduction in poverty and a more even distribution of wealth. And it's anthropologists that are, even economic anthropologists that are trying to determine if that's going to actually be the case with these policies that are set. And this goal of trying to create equity can often be thwarted by local elites that act to preserve or enhance their own positions. And this is sometimes problematic because what data do you get? An anthropologist can't just go to this elite, the person who's trying to implement the policy, and say, I've gathered all the data there is, they told me it's going to be fine. That's not good enough. You've got to actually see the whole scope of the entire community and the breadth of the impact of development that's going to take place. It's quite complicated. So how do you implement strategies for innovation and development that maximize a project's social and economic benefits? Well, you need to identify, like I said, the holistic approach. In your book, Kotak himself actually looked at a comparative analysis, that would be an ethnology, of 68 development projects that he determined, whereby he determined that culturally compatible economic development projects were twice as financially successful as incompatible ones. That is to say, the development projects that took into account the impact, the cultural impacts of those on the local people were more financially successful than the ones that just came in and steamrollered right over the local population. So it actually makes economic sense to do it right and to make equity for the local people. So what you don't want to do is over-innovate. You don't want to, which is development projects that require major changes to the target community's everyday lives. those are generally not particularly successful development projects. So what you need to do to avoid that over-innovation is to be sensitive to the culture and concerns of the community. And so that's where your ethnographic data will be very handy. You also don't want to under-differentiate. You don't want to say, okay, here is a community, they must behave exactly the way I do, or exactly the way I know this other community too. So let's just, I understand the way that they work, so they must work the exact same way. And this is an assumption that's often incorrect. You need to gather data from first-hand experience of that community, not assume that a community that is similar or even superficially similar to the one you're dealing with is going to be the same. So under differentiating communities and cultures can cause problems for development. And in fact, indigenous models for development can actually be preferable. Why don't you just include the people that you are going to be involving in the process of the development? And realistic development promotes change, but not over-innovation, by preserving and integrating local systems, social relations, hierarchies, and structure. So if you can say, look, how would you do this project, and involve the people that are going to be participating, that tends to be more successful. Changing focus a little bit here. Anthropology can be used not just as an academic discipline, as we're doing here, talking about it in education. Anthropology can be applied to educational programs. So for instance, linguistic anthropology can be applied to accommodating different linguistic and dialectic groups, also cultural differences, so sociolinguistics. There can be subtle differences in the way that language operates, symbolism works. Understanding human behavior helps with education, and also being specific for specific types of particular groups of people and how they can best succeed in education. Also, things like demographics in education, and also all across human behavior. More people are living in urban conditions these days. The human populations all across the world are becoming more and more urban. And so understanding the differences between rural communities and urban communities can help us to understand things like immigration, ethnicity, poverty, class differentiation, violence, and educational disparities. Something that is probably apparent to everybody right now, my quarantine beard speaks to this at the moment, where anthropology is also deals with medicine